Hi, we're continuing with the videos on borderline personality disorder individuals, adolescents, and young adults. This is really geared towards parents and how to better understand and conceptualize these issues for their children. Um, in the book I did, which the other YouTube channel is based on, I have criteria from both the DSM-5 and also non-DSM-5 criteria because there's so many issues which are pertinent to understanding borderlines conceptually and in terms of their functioning, which I therefore included as a separate chapter. And one thing which stands out, I want to include here for parents to understand for their children, is the child's hypersensitivity. And so many of the issues we're dealing with are particularly difficult to discern because adolescents in general can be very hypersensitive. They can have erratic moods, unstable behaviors. They're going through a lot of changes. They're learning about their identity, physically, sexually, emotionally, their place in the family, and as they relate to peers and classmates and so on. Some borderlines seem to have a protective guard due to their raw skin, so that when they feel the least bit threatened, judged, or criticized, a protective shield is activated. Hypersensitivity is a symptom, but also a defense against threatening triggers. And I'd like to talk about this and compare and contrast this to autism. Borderlines who experience childhood trauma needed to be paranoid, hypervigilant against danger to protect himself or others, which then became an ingrained mode of acting and thinking in adulthood. And parents always have to remember when we're talking about traumas in the life and the early development of a borderline, we're talking about perceived. That is, it's important to understand objectively, obviously, what occurs with the individual, but it's equally important to understand subjectively how that individual understands his or her own experience. And the single best way we know this as true is that we can take 3 or 4 children who grew up in the same home, and objectively they seem to have a very similar kind of environment and support system. However, we know that subjectively these 3 or 4 children will have a very different experience. Perhaps they may all have positive experiences, but they're different kinds of positive experiences. Inevitably, in a family with multiple children, it's the case that one child will have not just negative experiences that they will remember subjectively, but rather traumatic experiences. Being hypervigilant is therefore something very important in these kinds of children. As I noted in my book, I first became aware of it when I used to see people who had been incarcerated. They had developed a hypersensitivity so that they would remain safe in prison, always looking over their shoulders, paranoid, guarded. They would sometimes hold grudges, and they would be quite asocial in some ways. I'd also see it with people. I've done many immigration cases for sexual orientation asylum cases where people grew up in an environment where there was persecution or human rights violations against gays, for example, and these individuals would be very hypervigilant about how they would interact with others in the community or even when they were by themselves because they had to protect themselves. This hypersensitivity, this raw skinness, so to speak, is something that's very characteristic of many borderlines. And in general, borderlines, and this is not all of them, but this is an important subgroup, seem to be hypersensitive to things in general. And I don't just mean hypersensitivity to emotional volatility in the house, for example, but hypersensitivity to noise, hypersensitivity to touch, hypersensitivity to certain kinds of foods. Interestingly, I see many borderlines over the years who have had hypersensitivity leading to internal issues, particularly gastrointestinal problems, so that many of them get diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome, IBS. This has an important connection with autism. People with autism spectrum disorder have some similarities and overlapping characteristics with borderlines in this way. Like borderlines, a person with autism may also be particularly sensitive to noise, touch, sound, taste, and even smell, um, and sensitivity even in proximity to certain animals or people. Um, for people with autism, it could be partly a perceptual problem, even when there is no immediate objective test. Similar also to individuals with autism, the borderline may have difficulty communicating, communicating his needs in an effective manner, either with words or through body language. And the borderline sometimes has difficulty discerning what other people are trying to communicate with them, also verbally, but also through body language. When this occurs, empathy for self or other is very difficult to achieve because you feel you're not connecting with the other person and you're speaking across the other person. You know, you can imagine if you're a healthy individual who generally understands what someone is trying to relate to you, both verbally and non-verbally, and then take 24 hours where that is removed from your life. Maybe it's removed from your life because you're in an environment where you don't understand what people are saying, or you're in an environment where the body language is very exotic or foreign to you. What's it like? You feel very lost. You feel that not only are you not understanding what the other person is trying to communicate to you verbally or non-verbally, but you're not able to communicate to the other person verbally or non-verbally, and there's no intermediary mechanism that will allow this to happen in a meaningful way. The borderline, like the person with autism, must learn to decode his sensitivity and how to navigate his environment, or risk becoming overwhelmed all the time. And as a parent, you need to have sensitivity to this in order to have an idea of what triggers the child, what kind of smells and sights, what kind of interaction triggers the child. Is it very loud noises? Is it emotional volatility? Is it something else? For example, many borderlines are hypersensitive to uncertainty. Many borderlines are quite hypersensitive to unpredictability. And indeed, when you have an individual who can enjoy a much greater sense of stability and security in their life, a much greater sense of safety, they are generally less hypersensitive because they don't need to be hypersensitive, because they enjoy a kind of sameness, a kind of predictability interpersonally and given their environment. As a result, hypersensitivity for the borderline may be an overwhelming issue, and there can be ways to intervene in the home. And that may mean ensuring that the child is in a room that is less noisy, perhaps, ensuring the child has the ability to say, I really can't be at dinner tonight. I'm feeling overwhelmed, and the parents being okay with that. Perhaps it has to do with the child becoming involved in activities or hobbies that don't trigger the hypersensitivity of the child with borderline personality disorder, by having them engage in perhaps activities that allow them a sense of calm, or perhaps allow them a certain sort of sameness. In fact, there are certain activities, and this is true for adults, where if you remove any sort of hypersensitivity, they can enjoy a real sense of stability. And I have this in my book, but I'll mention it now. One is, believe it or not, reading. If you can get your child to read for an hour or two every day, particularly history or biography, the act of reading will preclude the child from becoming, um, what's the word? Will preclude the child from becoming distracted or otherwise defocused from that task. And another example is certain kinds of sports, such as swimming. This is not really true of martial arts and so on, but in swimming, if you can have the child do an hour of repetitive laps in a pool, especially if that child has earplugs and goggles and so on, you're enwrapped in a world where sensitivity becomes muted. In the child's everyday life, the parent should also consider ways to allow this child to enjoy being within the home environment and with family members in a way that will attack this problem, but without, undermining family integrity in general. And as I said, for example, having the child have a room that shields against noise, understanding the triggers for that child, and so on. These sound like oversensitive things, excuse the pun, meaning that many people think, oh my God, you're being so gentle with this child, allow that, the child to grow and develop and know that the world is not perfect and the world has harms and the world is loud and the world can be difficult and the world can be messy. But if you're saying that, then you're not really in tune with this particular issue. You would never say that to a child with autism. You would never say that to a child with autism who has communication difficulty, interpersonal and social difficulties, and so on, hypersensitivity. You just wouldn't, because it's recognized as a very serious issue, autism. With borderlines, because some of these hypersensitivity issues are not immediately evident, because so many people who have borderline personality disorder appear very normal in many ways, it can be more difficult to maintain that kind of concern for this particular issue. However, for parents, if you can really figure out what triggers the child in terms of their personal hypersensitivity, very much as you would have the same concerns for an individual with autism, it will go along allowing this child to have a much calmer, safer, more secure sense within the home, a calmer, more secure sense within their own internal world and in their environment. And that in turn will lead to a greater sense of trust, a greater sense of interpersonal calm, and a real sense from the borderline's perspective that, you really seem to understand and appreciate those particular things that are harmful to me. Another example, a child who has food sensitivity or allergies, one would never think to harm or give even a small amount of that food to a child with a food sensitivity or an allergy. Same kind of consideration needs to be afforded for the child with borderline personality disorder by parents.